Thank you, Abby. So we are delighted today to welcome Dr. Jan Vandeburie here to BYU. Dr. Vandeburie obtained his PhD in medieval studies at the University of Kent in 2015 and specializes in religious and cultural interactions between East and West in the medieval Mediterranean. He's held research fellowships at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, at the Warburg Institute, at the Leverhulme Trust, and at St. Edmund's College in Cambridge. He has also been affiliated with the Royal Holloway University of London, the Cambridge Muslim College, and the University of Leicester. He currently divides his time between the University of Manchester, where he coordinates study abroad partnerships, and the Wolf Institute, Cambridge, where he is a research associate. And I'll also add that for some of you in the room, he's been your teacher during the Wolf Institute summer program at Cambridge University. He has many, many publications, including some forthcoming publications that are quite interesting in the Cambridge history of the Crusades, and also a forthcoming chapter in a book on a century of state making in Iraq by Palgrave. So we will also should mention that he is currently an NEH fellow, a visiting fellow at the Vatican Film Library at St. Louis University, where he's working on a monograph about the topic of his presentation today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vandeburie to BYU.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Now I have to live up to that. And good to see so many familiar faces from the Cambridge Summer School. It's nice to have you here. Thank you all for coming in such numbers. Can you hear me okay? Is that fine? Yeah. Right, so today what I want to do is introduce you to Jacques de Vitry. He was a 12th, 13th century preacher. I don't expect any sort of background knowledge of that time, that context, so I hope I can, give you some introductory material there. Nonetheless, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to do so afterwards. And what I want to do in the talk is to first introduce Jacques de Vitry and his writings, and his career and his writings. And then I'll go into a bit more detail about his approaches to shared sacred space. Depending on the time that we have, I may cut that down or extend on that. I'd like to, and thank you again for inviting me over. Should have started with that, really. I'd like to start one of my favorite quotes from Jacques de Vitry. An episode he describes one of his letters, and I'll go back to sort of his career, but just at this point in time, he was just appointed Bishop of Saint-Jean d'Acre in Holy Land, and he was on his way from Paris, where he was based, the north of France, where he was based, through the Alps, all the way to the papal court, where the Pope was residing, Innocent III, to take up his appointment as bishop, and then to go to the Holy Land by ship. And I relate to this quite a bit because he's dragging along loads of books on his mules, and he gets into trouble in a wild river in the Italian sort of side of the Alps, where one of his mules almost drowns because of the weight of the books, and miraculously the mule gets saved because it also carries the finger relic of the woman he supported, Mary of Oigny. I'll talk about her in just a moment. The image, by the way, is AI. The rest of my images will be, and I try to select sort of proper medieval documents and imagery, but AI, as you can see, can do some pretty good medieval style images. Anyway, why this quote aside from the books? Also because I want to point out that sort of that first line there, he says, "The devil threw my weapons, that is my books, with which I decided to attack him." And that's his context. He's a preacher. And everything that he does and writes throughout this talk, we have to kind of see it in that context. And I'll explain how that then kind of reflects on his ideas about Islam and his writings about Islam throughout my talk. Luckily, he could still read all his books. It was just a bit sort of faded out. But let's go back to where he was born, around 1165, in the Champagne region of France. He went on to study in Paris, and then he went on to become a canon regular, essentially a regular monk in Namur, in the Saint Nicolas Douanier Priory, and I'll talk about the reasons for that in a minute. But it's important to consider that he was born in Champagne. Champagne region of France at that time was a hotbed of crusading ideology, especially in the 12th century. A lot of Champagne noblemen had gone on crusade, First Crusade, Second Crusade, and Third Crusade as well. And everything in that region sort of breathed crusading ideas, the sculpture in the churches, the wall paintings, everything was about crusading, and that's quite important to think about when you think of his origins. And then a brief sort of introduction in a kind of very, very little nutshell, what had happened on the Crusades until then. Things originated when the Seljuk Turks coming from Central Asia had moved into the Byzantine Empire in the late 11th century. They had defeated the Byzantines quite definitively at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and then pushed them all the way back to kind of the edges of what is now Turkey. And then also pushed the Fatimid Empire, which was a Shia Islam empire, while the Seljuks were Sunni Islam, pushed them back as well. And that's important to think about when we think about what happened on the First Crusade. I'll say that in a minute. But as a result, the Byzantine Emperor was panicking, and he asked for help to the West, again, to simplify matters. He was expecting to get an army to help them out, but what he got was a sort of, and I like this image of it, he got a not quite knowing what to do and where to look and where to go, rabble of people on that First Crusade who were told by people like Peter the Hermit and the Pope, Urban II at that time, they were told to go to the east, to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, to liberate the holy places. But they had no idea where they were going. They had never been there. And the First Crusade should have been an enormous disaster, but exactly because of that kind of divide between these huge Sunni and Shia Islamic empires, they were able to kind of wiggle their way in between them, and then, again, long story short, establish what was called the Crusader states. These were sort of four kingdoms: Jerusalem, County of Tripoli, Antioch, and then Edessa, created in a European kind of feudal model, sort of like European states at that time, but planted in the Middle East. That went well for a bit until pressure kind of built up, and someone like Saladin, I'm sure you've heard that name, many of you, before, was able to unify Egypt and Syria, so the south and the north of the Crusader kingdoms, into one empire under his sultanate, and defeat the Franks, as they were called, the Christians, the Western Christians based in the Holy Land, in the Battle of Hattin, 1187. And this is an interesting image of that. He's sort of seen here to be taking away their holy cross as well, the relic of the Holy Cross that they were dragging around everywhere. He's taking it away from them, and that was a huge kind of thing in the West, in Europe. So what we have left at this point, at the time of Jacques, is the Third Crusade had failed as well. Richard the Lionheart, I'm sure you heard of him before, and the French king had failed to kind of make any difference. And sort of, well, this is 1190, so that was all that was left. City of Tyre, and then the county of Tripoli and Antioch for a bit. And then the Third Crusade manages to recapture a few places, like the city of Saint-Jean d'Acre, where Jacques will become bishop, but nothing substantial. Okay, that's a century of crusading in a very brief nutshell. we get to someone like Pope Innocent III, who epitomizes the idea of the medieval idea of a papal monarchy. The idea that the Pope had, aside from spiritual power, had also quite absolute temporal power over the nations, over the politics. And he was trying to get that established. And one of the ways to do that for him was to try to organize a new successful crusade. I'll skip over the Fourth Crusade, which didn't go anywhere. But then we get to the Fifth Crusade, which is the one we'll talk about in just a moment. If I'm, going too fast, or if I'm skipping bits that you're not familiar with, please do feel free to ask questions afterwards. I'm happy to talk about this a bit more. But why is Innocent III important is because he was a student at Paris in theology. And along with Jacques de Vitry as well. They were both students at Paris, Innocent III a bit before him. But Paris at that time was an interesting place. University of Paris was one of the major, if not the major place to study theology in the late 12th century. And we have quite a bit of writings from Jacques from his time as a student in Paris. And I've selected these few, and this isn't sort of the topic of my talk today, but to kind of give you an idea that he didn't really like his time as a student in Paris. He thought that many people studied for their, for selfish reasons, and he sort of commented on the fights and the infighting between the different nations, the different people. And I'll just read you the Flemish one, which, he calls them fickle, prodigal, gluttonous, yielding as butter, and slothful, and I can relate to that in a way. Anyway, we also have a book of him, interestingly, at the Bionica Library in Yale, where somebody who had bought it from him writes that this grammar book, it's a Latin grammar book, belonged to Jacques de Vitry, and I bought it for so-and-so this much money. And what's really interesting is that what may have been, not entirely sure, but Jacques throughout really detailed kind of notes as a student. And also perhaps his doodling. I think this is a math teacher that's about to get hit by a student who doesn't like math, clearly. Anyway, but it kind of shows the student life at that time, not much different from today, perhaps. More importantly, at that time in Paris, is that what we have quite recently arrived there is the Latin translation of the Quran. In the mid-12th century, more or less, Peter the Venerable, who was the abbot of Cluny, a big, important abbey, Benedictine abbey in France, had the idea to get to know their enemy Islam better by translating the Quran in Latin. And he kind of put together a team in Toledo, in Spain, where people were kind of familiar with both Arabic and Latin, to do a big project in translating not just the Quran, but all kinds of Islamic scripture, Islamic writings, biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, and so on. And you can see sort of here the oldest manuscript that we have of this from the 12th century is still in Paris at the moment, and it contains Robert of Ketton's translation of the Quran, this one. It contains Peter the Venerable's letters discussing Islam and all kinds of useful stuff to preach against Islam, but in a way to consider them to be heretics. That was the main point at that time. Peter the Venerable was mainly concerned with preaching against heresy, and he regarded Islam as a heresy as well. He recognized by translating the Quran that there's lots of overlap with Christianity, and his explanation was that it must have been because they're heretics from Christianity, and hence the large overlap. So that's the context in which Innocent, but also Jacques de Vitry, will be studying in Paris, learning about Islam for the first time in such detail, and being told by people like Peter the Venerable, well, he was passed away by then, but his successors, that Islam was a heresy that you had to kind of preach against and to try and theologically refute them. Jacques got bored or got annoyed at Paris and heard a story of a woman in Brabant, in the north, in what is now Namur in Belgium, then the north of France, called Mary of Oigny. And again, not the topic of my talk today, but she was a really interesting figure. She was known as a mulier sancta, a holy woman. She was very devout. She would sort of starve herself. She was very, what's the word? My English sometimes leaves me. What's the word I'm looking for? If you're starve yourself and you're ascetic. Thank you. Thank you. And you can see that in this image here, where she's on her deathbed, and she's wrapped in these sort of soft, silky textiles to protect her very fragile skin. The point was that Jacques de Vitry linked up with her and became her confessor. And she was the one that pushed him to become a preacher against the heretics in the south of France, what we know as the Cathars or the Albigensians. And before we go into that, I want to point this out. Remember the story of the finger of Mary of Oigny saving his mule with the books? That's still preserved in this, what is called a phylactery, which is in the original reliquary from that time by a goldsmith called Hugo of Oigny. And I want to point out that the Oigny treasure in Belgium at the moment is a fantastic example of a snapshot in history that was preserved. What happened was Jacques de Vitry's, all the stuff he sent back from the Middle East to the monastery. Normally these things got lost in Europe, in France, especially in the French Revolution, when the army kind of picked up all the gold and all the precious things and the books from the churches. But the people in Oigny hid it in a nearby farm, and that's why we still have that particular treasure entirely intact. And why is this interesting and important? Because we have a pretty much complete episcopal kind of the attributes of Jacques de Vitry preserved until today. So we have his rings, his staff, his mitres. One of them is parchment, illuminated parchment, so on calf skin, like a manuscript, and his manipule. And I'll talk about this one in just a moment. And then as a preacher, we also have his portable altar. It's quite tiny, about this big, very flat, pocket size. So he'd been going around with that in the Middle East to preach, to go around, to travel. And it's the perfect size for it. It contains a bunch of relics that you can read here to do with the Middle East, Holy Cross, and so on. But, so Mary of Oigny had convinced him to preach against the heretics in the south of France. That's in the context of what will be known as the Albigensian Crusade. You may have heard of that before. It was a crusade, and here you see Pope Innocent III excommunicating the Albigensians, the people from the south of France, regarded as heretical. We can discuss a lot about that, and it's not the topic of my talk today, but essentially it was a political motivation. The northern French lords wanted to have more control over the southern French lords, and that's why they convinced the Pope, look, if you want us to go on a crusade to the Middle East, we want you to make this campaign against the south of France also a crusade. And that's what happened. And Jacques got involved in preaching that. And that's where we get an interesting kind of viewpoint of a preacher at that time from very personal kind of anecdotes. He mentions here in the Vita he wrote, so the saint's life of Mary of Oigny, that he authored after her death to make her become a saint. He mentions that in the beginning he was very he felt himself unworthy to preach the word of God. He didn't have the experience nor the practice, and then he was always fearful that he wouldn't give the perfect sermon. And he says that he would collect all kinds of references, all kinds of material in his head, and then sort of blurt it out, or at least that's what he thought he did. And I always feel like that when I'm teaching or when I'm speaking as well. I can relate to that as well. Now, a little bit later, Thomas of Cantimpré, who wrote an addition to that Vita, the Saint's Life of Mary of Oigny, points out that within a short amount of time he had become a really famous preacher, really kind of good. In short time, such a preeminence in preaching that scarcely any mortal could equal him in expounding the scriptures and destroying sins. So he had a bit of reputation at that point. Until today, his model sermons, his collections of sermons where he basically wrote down for preachers how to deliver a sermon and what kind of content to put into it for certain occasions, the so-called sermones ad status, so sermons for a particular occasion or a particular audience, are still, together with those of Humbert of Romans and Guibert de Tournai, are still very famous and still had a huge impact on preaching in the later Middle Ages. And this is an example of one of those manuscripts from that time. It's the table of contents with a really handy kind of lookup system, which was fairly unique for that time, looking up, the topics or the audiences you want to preach for, and then it tells you where to find a particular sermon. Anyway, at that point in time, Islam and Muslims do get mentioned in his sermons. He hasn't gone to the East yet, but they get mentioned as a way to as exemplar, basically, as a small story to give a message, to give a lesson to the people, the Western audiences. For example, we have here one where a Christian butcher in the Middle East, in the Crusader states, was selling bad food to the pilgrims in the Holy Land. He was captured by the Saracens. Saracens are, by the way, Muslims. That's the medieval name that they gave to in the medieval West to Muslims, who took him before the Sultan, and then the butcher asked to be released because he was basically killing Christians. So why would the Sultan complain about that? And then the Sultan laughed and let him go. And obviously the lesson is, treat your fellow Christians correctly. The second example is about Saladin, the Sultan who had in 1187 recently conquered Jerusalem from the Christians, taken away the cross, as you saw. And he said that he was about to die, and he ordered a small piece of cloth to be carried around his kingdom, telling people, look, this is the only thing I could take of all my riches, all my wealth in the afterlife. Again, the message that even such a huge sultan like Saladin has nothing once he passes away. And that last story is interesting because it fits into a wider, at that point in time, wider idea where Saladin becomes a sort of hero in the West. So despite having recaptured Jerusalem from them in 1187 and taken away the cross, there's an interesting thing that happens in the literature about him in the medieval West, where he gets depicted, in this case, in a lineup of great Christian kings and leaders. He's next to Charlemagne here, for example, carrying, a sword, but also a piece of bread, the symbol of peace. The reason behind this is interesting. Richard the Lionheart had gone the Third Crusade, had come back without any result, but also Saladin didn't succeed in completely defeating the Christian armies. So when Richard came back home, he had to kind of sell to his people that he had to cut a deal with somebody who was known as the Antichrist for taking back Jerusalem. And so he started to kind of depict Saladin as a very magnanimous, chivalric, honorable, almost like a knight person. And that stuck. And so his reputation until today, if you've seen movies like Kingdom of Heaven, that reputation of Saladin as a wise, kind of not quite adversarial Muslim leader stuck because of Richard trying to sell his failure at home. Anyway, but so that's the context of using Islam at that point. He had not gone yet to the east. He goes to Rome, to Perugia at least, where the papal court was. He finds Innocent III dead. He had just passed away, and famously he found him laying naked because robbers had stolen his clothes of the Pope, and he made a point about how transient the vain glory of life is. Anyway, he takes up his position nonetheless. He goes all the way to Saint-Jean d'Acre in the Holy Land, and he finds the place to be a bit of a surprise. And this image, by the way, is from a project in Belgium where they reconstructed his face, his features, and also they put that parchment illuminated mitre on top of his head in the reconstruction. I'll tell you in a moment why I think that is. As bishop, he arrived and he found the city of Acre like a beast with 9 heads. This is an apocalyptic reference, obviously, but what he finds is a huge amalgamation, random collection of various Christian groups. Because if you think about the map I showed you at that time, Saint-Jean d'Acre or Acre was the capital of Jerusalem kingdom, but they had nothing else in that region. So all the bishops who no longer had their seats, all the different groups, Italians, the English, the French, they all had to be kind of packed together in that city, and that's why he finds it very overwhelming. He also makes a point about how the place had become a safe haven for outlaws. Also in medieval Europe, you could get condemned for your crimes by being sent to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage or a crusade, and many people saw it as a nice chance to kind of build a new life over there. A bit like Australia was later times. So he, again, didn't have a good time, and he sort of said, he was fearful and trembling. And this is where I think this mitre, that design, fits really well. He had to stand out. He was the bishop of that place, despite having all other kinds of bishops and leaders there. And they wouldn't listen to him, clearly. So that design kind of points out, there's the apostles here, there's a Christ on top, there's Mary, and in the middle of it, there's a bishop, the kind of figure of a bishop to emphasize his authority. And the mitre itself is the only unique example we have of any of like that from medieval Europe. So it must have stood out, it must have sort of gotten the attention of people. Nonetheless, and this is a second mitre he has, depicting in this case, the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, and the back of it has the martyrdom of Thomas Becket on it, so 2 bishops who were also killed for their efforts for the faith. So he kind of, again, identifies himself with those kind of saints in his efforts in the East. Sees himself as a martyr, basically. But what he does get quite active in going around with an escort in many cases to preach not just to Eastern Christian community, but also to Muslims. He tries to address them, he tries to kind of send messengers to them, he tries to send letters, and he uses interpreters to write in Arabic. He didn't know Arabic himself. But at the end of sort of his account from that time, he does point out that he's looking forward for the crusade, the Fifth Crusade at that time, to arrive, because he's not really working for him there. And this is a map of his travels around the East, which is quite impressive. We get to the Fifth Crusade arriving, the one that Innocent III had thoroughly planned, but he didn't see to be completed. At least it was planned well, but it didn't end up well. So they tried to attack Cairo, but they already failed at Damietta, a harbor city in Egypt, where they got stuck. Essentially, they got besieged by a Muslim army and had to surrender. Perhaps another famous episode of this crusade is that St. Francis of Assisi was also there. And he went out of the Christian camp to try and convert the Muslim Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil. And there's a lot of kind of famous paintings of this episode. We can discuss whether it happened or not, but he tried to convert the Sultan, but it obviously did not work. And I think the combination of the crusade failing and then sort of the most famous preacher of that time, St. Francis, trying to convert the Sultan, combined really hit Jacques hard. He had hoped for everything to be successful. He had preached to that effect, but it didn't work out. And we get this really interesting letter in the Vatican archives, which was sent personally by the Pope back then to Jacques. It wasn't a letter to all the kind of bishops in the East, but to him alone. And he points out, I selected a few things here. He points out that the Pope has heard that you are desiring a retreat, and that you're such a good preacher, and you seem to have given up. What's going on? And at the end of it, he says, please hang in there, stay strong. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, is coming to help on the Crusades. Please hang in there, or essentially, he says a bit later, I'll be quite angry with you. But so there's a bit of threats, a bit of kind of sweet talking, but clearly Jacques is suffering. And I think he really was suffering from a breakdown, a burnout, essentially. So in a few years, he goes back to the West, takes up an unassuming role as a helping bishop in Liège, and then ends up being appointed by his good friend Gregory IX, who had become Pope, to be a cardinal. And he disappears off the radar. He does sign the most papal documents of any cardinal around that time, so he must have been very active in supporting the Pope, but he's sort of in the background. And to the extent that Thomas of Cantimpré mentions that, look, you were such a great preacher, where are you? What are you doing? I'm being told that you're sitting in Rome, suited and quiet, reading books. Where's that fervor of conscientious preaching? So he did suffer a breakdown from being in the East. Now, all of that to kind of introduce then, the main points I want to make about his approach to Islam and how that has changed in the broader sense, the approach of the Western Church to Islam. While he's in the East, he is collecting material for a large treatise, the Historia Orientalis Abbreviata, or the short history of Jerusalem, essentially comprising of a compendium of information, encyclopedic information about the East, its people, Islam, and so on. He introduces it by saying that we were stuck in Damietta, and to deal with the boredom, he looked in the cupboards of the Latins, the Greeks, and the Arabs, and collected all the information. He wanted to write something that helps, something that remembers all the good deeds of the Lord. And he says it's going to be 3 books. A first book, everything happening in the East. Second book, what's happening in the West. And then a third book, which never materialized, because then he got sort of that burnout and he stopped writing, everything that was going to happen on the Crusade and afterwards. Interestingly, at the end, for our purposes, he addresses the reader and he says, this treatise will be for those who fight under the banner of Christ, strengthening the faith, reform the morals, refute the infidels, confuse the impious people, and finally, to follow in the footsteps of good men. And that's where we can see his preaching attitude. He's not a historian. He's not somebody who writes just information. He wants it for a certain purpose. The context of this book is very much apocalyptic. This is a famous image from Joachim of Fiores, just a bit before that, really popular apocalyptic work where he describes a dragon with 7 heads, 7 antichrists essentially. The 6th one, as you can see here, is Saladin, the recent one, and then the final one at some point to come and introduce the end of times, the apocalypse. And just to give you a sense of, how Jacques frames his book is that I think that he modeled it on Joachim of Fiori's Antichrist, but in his case, he selected the 7 Antichrists that destroyed Jerusalem. And so he's waiting for a final attack on Jerusalem by the Christians to take it back before then the final Antichrist can attack it, if that kind of makes sense in a nutshell. But that's his idea, and the reason is urgent. He wants the Crusades, the urgency of people to kind of recapture Jerusalem. The contents of it, again in a nutshell, the first sections talk about the Prophet Muhammad, Islam, and various Muslim groups. Then the First Crusade and the Crusader states. Further history of what's happening in the 12th century. Then a detailed account of all the different Christian groups in the East, military orders, Templars, and so on. Then a detailed account of the Eastern Christian groups and the Jews. And then, interestingly, a detailed account of the natural world, animals, plants, stones, and so on. And then a kind of final bit on Saladin and recent events. For our interests, this is the section on Islam, and these are the kind of topics that he addresses. As you can see, it kind of addresses both the history, or at least the Western view on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and then also the doctrine of Islam, but also addresses sort of different groups of Muslims that he seems to be aware of. What's interesting about his writings about Islam is that they are quite unique, to be so extensive, but also to have an approach to Islam as I said earlier, with his preaching background, Islam as a result of Christian sin and Christian discord. And he uses anecdotes from Islam, from the Quran, from the Prophet Muhammad's life, as exemplar, basically, as a preacher, to give a lesson to the Christians. And I selected this one for today, which is on alcohol. So he points out that Muslims don't drink alcohol, that the Prophet kind of pointed out they shouldn't drink alcohol. But he says that makes them, more active in producing children, and they have more defense of their faith. So he's kind of like reprimanding the Christians for being too much of drunkards, which was a big theme at that time, by the way, in church reform, to reduce the amount of alcohol consumption. For example, he also has the first insight in that context of what jihad is. Authors before him would say that Muslims were fighting for their families, for their homes, for their land. He's the first one to point out, and I'm sorry, I realized that a few Latin quotes I forgot to put the English in, but he points out that the Prophet Muhammad had told his followers that they should shed their blood in defense of their faith. So he has a sense of the idea of jihad. People before him did not, and that is quite similar to their idea of holy war. Again, in the context of pointing out that defeating them won't be as easy. Again, sorry, I forgot the English, but essentially here he's saying, before I showed you the letters where he's pointing out that where he's going around and among the Muslims trying to reach them, a bit later when he writes his Historia Orientalis, he has reached a kind of more defeatist point, where he says that we have loads of people that we send to preach to the Muslims, but anybody who succeeds in reaching them gets killed immediately once they refute the Prophet, once they attack the Prophet. And then he quotes the Quran in saying that this is what the Prophet told them, that his word is the only true word, and you should kill anybody else who says differently, or paraphrase the Quran at least. So that's a change in attitude towards Islam. He does try to, aside from the theological bits and the refutation, he does try to also collect information about Islam clearly. This is where he talks about Dome of the Rock, and he understands that despite kind of still having that tradition that it was the location of the Temple of Solomon, where Jesus as a child was sent to by his mother. He does point out that the Muslims go there to venerate the place and held it in great veneration. His writings, in a nutshell again, his writings lead to a interesting development in the West, or his writings and others as well, from that time, where basically by presenting Dome of the Rock as the Temple of Solomon in artwork, that's being taken over, and they depict the Temple of Solomon as the Dome of the Rock, as an Islamic building essentially, with a bit of artistic license, but that's just a side point. He spots, for example, he describes an animal, which is he calls a chimera, which is high in the front and low in the back, and that the Muslims parade around on a holy feast day. What he actually describes is this: it's the Kiswa procession in Cairo, where every year for the holy pilgrimage, they bring around from Cairo all the way to Mecca for the Hajj. They bring around the cloths for the door of the Kaaba, and the way they do that since the Middle Ages is by putting that inside a kind of building on top of a camel. And so he must have seen that, or he must have heard of that, but hadn't realized, because he didn't speak Arabic, or he came from the West, didn't realize what that was, and thinks it's some kind of weird animal being paraded around. Another example of him being confused about a type of snake, because a popular book was going around among in the Arabic world about snakes, but I'll skip that for now. Now, to end this, I want to point out that his approach to Islam, which was a combination of, as I said, the Quran being translated in Paris, so a deep knowledge of that, but also his personal experiences, make him one of the main sources of knowledge about Islam in the West for some time to come. And we can see that by his book being renamed the Book About Muhammad, even though only 6 chapters basically dealt with Islam and Muhammad. People copied the whole thing and added it to, for example, in this case, collections of later writings about Islam from missionaries like the Col de Monte Croce, and renamed it the Book of Muhammad. And there's a few examples of this. I just put one up that shows you how much impact his work had in the West, or a lasting impact. One example of that impact is the Franciscan so-called, or what I just called, rough guides to the Holy Land. Franciscans were allowed by Muslim leaders to be in charge of the Holy Sepulchre, of the tomb of the Lord, and to kind of cater to pilgrims and Franciscans and missionaries, they produced these, and I found a new one fairly recently. They produced these tiny, about this big, very cheaply made travel guides to help pilgrims go around the Holy Land. And in that, and you can see that here, they use Jacques de Vitry, they use Jacques de Vitry's writings, selections of it, to help them on their pilgrimage, again for centuries to come after that. And I like this image. It reminds me of your missionaries, of Franciscans carrying on a little book and going on mission to the east. Now, since the time is about done, I want to point out just one case where he writes about a holy place that is shared between Muslims and Christians, and how he writes about that. It's a place in Syria. Tortosa is the Latin name in the Middle Ages, but it's now called Tartus. It used to have a very early church to do with in honor of the Virgin Mary, and it had what is so-called one of the Horegetria, one of the miraculous images of the Virgin holding baby Jesus. When the Crusaders took that place, they built a very large Frankish European-style cathedral there, in which one of those pillars in here they housed, is now a museum, where they housed that kind of shrine, that holy image. And Jacques, who clearly went to that place on his travels, writes about it that, interestingly, that the Lord makes so many miracles there that even the Saracens come there as pilgrims. And he has a few of those observations on his travels. And I find it interesting because he's the first one, or among the first one, to point that out at that time. And then those of you who've been to the summer school will what I'm going to say now will sound familiar. He's not the only one that does this at that time. There's a few other ones that point to Muslims venerating what they consider to be their holy places, to do with Mary mostly, like Saidnaya in Syria or the Al-Matariya garden in Cairo. And there's clearly a change in discourse, and I think Jacques Orientalis is quite central in this, where before that they were quite negative of, well, not negative, but they didn't quite realize how big Mary was for Muslims. So they would mention something like the Saracens destroying the Mount Zion Church of Mary, or insulting Mary, but that obviously Muslims wouldn't do that. On the Muslim side of things, there was no necessarily a kind of, on their side, appreciation of more, of going more to Christian holy places. They had just lost Jerusalem. Saladin was clearly trying to stop any kind of shared interaction. So what happened? In the West, in the 12th century, there's an increase in interest in Mary. Her cult grows quite a bit. And because pilgrims go to the East, they bring back stories of Mary and her holy shrines, her holy places and relics. And that kind of generates more interest in Mary, and that creates an exponential result. But why is it happening then? Why at that time? And that's where I think people like Jacques come in, and all the stuff that I said earlier, where this is where he quotes the Quran in his manuscripts, where someone like Jacques and people shortly after him, the missionaries, know the Quran at that point, at least in Latin. And they know that in the Quran, Mary is a huge figure. She has 2 chapters devoted to her, 2 surahs. She is mentioned more than she is mentioned in the New Testament. She is the only woman mentioned by name in the Quran. Everybody else is sort of wife of, daughter of, mother of. So they realize that Mary is this huge figure in Islam. But this is just an example of some other people that at the same time after Jacques have that knowledge. So what happens is Mary becomes more popular in the West. The Quran gets translated in Paris, or arrives in Paris, and people like Jacques have this interest in Islam and in the holy places that are shared by Muslims and Christians, and they wonder why they write about it. And they explain it by pointing out that in Islam, Mary is quite important. So these narratives spread in the West, and they combine into a reputation of Mary as a super saint, essentially, at that time. I'll skip this one. So, at the end of this, 2 parts. The first part is that Jacques de Vitry's Historia Orientalis, I think, represents a turning point, where close knowledge of the Latin Quran, uniquely in his case, combines with his experience in the East, preaching, or trying to preach at least, trying to convert, and the Fifth Crusade, which ultimately fails. And he understands that he's disappointed, and he concludes that crusades are not going to be successful, and that Muslims couldn't be approached like heretics. So this is the beginning of the idea of mission to the East, of the idea of trying to reach them in a renewed conversion effort. And that'll jump to the Mongols afterwards, but this is not enough time for that today. We can see that his work, which makes that point, has a huge impact in centuries after that. And then the second part of that is that this increased interest in Islam at that time by Jacques and his contemporaries, people just after him, who read him, who copy him, who reference him, will lead to an exponential rise in the cult of Mary. So that kind of impact comes back to the West and contributes to a huge interest in Mary. To be clear, that doesn't reflect there was more sharing between Muslims and Christians at that time. The audiences were fellow preachers and intellectuals and missionaries, not necessarily broad audiences. This is the context of moving from crusade to mission and seeing somebody like Mary as an ideal figure to combine sort of both sides, or to get both sides together and to get their conversion goals established. And perhaps importantly, this isn't a sort of all happy together story. It's polemical. They still, as the quote said from Jacques de Vitry, even the Saracens come to our saint. So it's still sort of the Christian Mary, in their view, that is the most important one, and even the Muslims come here, so they, they are subject to the Christian faith in that context at least. Yeah, I think that's it. I know I skipped over a lot of things, but happy to take any questions.
We have just a couple of minutes for those who stay and maybe ask one or two questions, and then we will wrap up right at the hour. So, I see a hand back here. And there's a microphone, so please state your name and if you're a student, your major.
Hi, I'm Claire. I'm a student in computer science, and my question is, what motivated him to, or inspired him to, use a more holistic approach to describe Islam? I don't know if you covered it already, but.
Good question. I think it's the access to the Quran in Latin that changed it for him. He was the first one, as far as I can tell, or the first one that we know of and that we have writings of, who knew the Quran from studying it in Paris, at least in Latin translation, and then with that information went to the East, and clearly didn't just sit there, but went around and tried to preach, tried to convert, and so I think that combination, that led to his kind of interest in Islam, or the changing approach to it at least. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm studying Ancient Near Eastern with a focus on Biblical Hebrew. So my question is, you said that this was a primary source. I didn't catch it if you said that this was like a main primary source, but are there others who have more, how do I explain it? Are there better primary sources than Jacques? Or is there like a certain reason that you chose him for your interest in?
So he's a unique source in the sense that there is nothing like his collection of information before it. So it's quite a few things are taken from various sources, but a lot of it is his own kind of, finding information, his own experience added to that. But shortly after him, you will get, and I skipped over that one, but you will get people like Ricoldo de Montecroce, who is a missionary in the East, who will take Jacques' information and advance it, because he did know Arabic. That's the big kind of change compared to Jacques. And this is, for example, we have Ricoldo's at least, we have his own copy of the Quran still preserved, his personal copy he was carrying around with him as a missionary, which has Latin comments in the margins. So you do get after Jacques people who use kind of Jacques' information and kind of go with it and expand on it, definitely. But before him, there's nobody of that extent. There is somebody called William of Tyre that you may have heard of, those of you familiar with Crusade studies, who supposedly has written a history of Islam as well, but it's lost, which also means it can't have been that popular if we have no copies of it left. So anyway, yeah.
Hi, Jan, and thank you again for this tremendously rich kind of presentation. In the conclusions, what I focused on was your note that it was the realization, and I'm reading into it a little bit here, that the Crusades were not working.
Yeah.
That then leads to this new approach, which you are very delicate about describing, and then how influential this approach is. Do you conclude, more broadly speaking, that this is what it took for Christians to take a new approach? So Christ says, knock. They want to break the door down. Oh, we're not getting in. We better knock again.
Yeah.
Is it the realization that the Crusades are not working, force is not working, or am I reading too much into this?
No, you're right. You're exactly right. I tried to put it carefully because people might, argue against that. It's a very it's a big point to make, with such little information at the moment, but there is more. No, you're right. So I think Jacques, as an influential person, and his book having so many copies later on preserved, he is what I would call a proto-mendicant. So he is around there in the context of St. Francis, but he's going around before the Franciscans are, before Dominicans are. He's going around doing mendicant preaching and conversion work before they are actually doing it properly organized. And I think he's the inspiration. Loads of those mendicants, Burkard of Mount Zion, famous Dominicans, famous Franciscans, who will go to the East to preach and try to convert, they quote Jacques. They mention him, they reference him, they use sections of his book. So I think you're right. I think this is a turning point where he at least realizes the big crusading efforts, because you'll have some later on, but they will be more private enterprises, like the King of France and Louis afterwards. The big crusading efforts, all of Europe together trying to go there, don't work. They're too powerful. And I think he is the beginning of a huge shift in the Christian church's approach to the East, in leaving the military option, but trying to reach out to them. That said, it's a very short window, because then you get the Mongols arriving, and they have to pick a side. They have to pick a side between Muslims and Mongols, and they go for the Mongols as a potential ally against the Muslims. If it wasn't for the Mongols arriving, there would have been more of an effort by Dominicans to go to the Muslims, I think. Yeah, but you're right. That is the point I'm carefully trying to make. That it is definitely, he's central in that shifting point. Yeah.
Well, if you'll join me in thanking Dr. Vandeburie again for his wonderful talk today.
Thank you for coming.